Okay, so hi everybody. Let's get started. My name is Maya Schonbach, and I am a clinical psychologist in training. And today I'll talk about some of the research behind skin picking and hair pulling disorders. And it'll be a brief webinar, probably around 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. And we'll have time for some questions and answers at the end. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, I ask that you type them in on the chat, as I see that some of you already have. And I'll be able to answer them at the end, and we can discuss towards the end of the presentation. So let's get started. So today, what we're going to talk about, so first, I'll give kind of a background on genetics, kind of just some brief information that is key to know and understand for today's talk. And no means it's a deep in-depth course, Genetics 101, but just some understanding. We'll talk about why it's important to understand the genetics behind BFRBs, which are body-focused repetitive behaviors, of which skin picking and hair pulling disorders are in that family. And then speaking of family, we'll talk about some familial studies and also twin studies that have been conducted specifically on these disorders. And then we'll talk about some specific genes that have been found to be implicated in hair pulling and skin picking disorders. So before we start this talk, I really want to start with a disclaimer. It really is important to note that genetics is just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding BFRBs. So these behaviors are extremely complex. Likely they're influenced by a combination of factors, a combination of genetics, environmental factors, and psychological factors as well. So therefore, it's really important to have a comprehensive understanding of BFRBs. It's important to have a multidimensional approach that takes into account a variety of factors as well as their interactions with each other. So research does suggest that both trichotillomania or hair pulling disorder and excoriation disorder or skin picking disorder do have a genetic component, meaning that genetic factors may contribute to the development of these conditions. However, the specific genes and genetic mechanisms involved in these disorders really are still being investigated. So further studies are needed in order to uncover the specific genes and the specific genetic mechanisms that are involved. Also, it's important to say that the field is constantly evolving. So all the time, there's more advanced technology, there's new discoveries coming out. It really is constantly changing. So it's important to, first of all, stay updated. And again, just take everything all the studies that I'm going to talk about today with a grain of salt. It's important to kind of keep everything in proportion. Okay, so let's start with a little bit of genetics background. So what are genetics? Genetics is the study of genes, of heredity, and of the variation among living organisms. So it really focuses on understanding how traits are passed from one generation to another, as well as the mechanisms that govern this inheritance. So genes specifically are segments of DNA that contain the instructions for building and maintaining an organism. So genes help determine various traits like physical characteristics, susceptibility to diseases, and even certain behaviors. So inheritance occurs when genes are passed down from parents to their offspring. Now, this process follows specific patterns, including things like having a dominant or recessive gene or traits, and they can be influenced by multiple factors, things like genetic mutations, as well as genetic recombination. Those things we don't really need to get into today. Genetic variation is also important. It refers to the diversity of genes and traits within a population. So again, it arises from a combination of genetic mutations, of recombination and reproduction, as well as gene flow between different populations. And then finally, an important term to know is a heritability estimate. So heritability estimates tell us what proportion of variation in a given behavior or a disorder is due to genes versus the environment. And these estimates, they range from 0 to 1, with 0 indicating that genetics are not a contributing factor at all, and 1 indicates that genetics are the only factor. So, for example, things like religion or the language that's spoken at home have a heritability of 0 because they're not under genetic control. And conversely, disorders that are caused by a single gene variant typically have a high heritability estimate, close to 1. Skin picking and hair pulling disorder are not those. There are specific disorders like PKU. If you want to look into that, that's a separate talk. Okay, but let's get started on our topics. So why is it important to understand the genetics behind BFRBs? So if we can identify specific genetic markers, it can help us with early diagnosis and potentially early intervention as well. And if we can identify these disorders earlier, we can help people receive appropriate treatment and support and potentially reduce the impact of these behaviors on their lives. And then in terms of targeted treatments, a better understanding of the genetic basis of these disorders can help us target specific biological pathways, specific genetic mechanisms that may be implicated in these disorders. And ultimately, this can lead to more effective and personalized treatment approaches. And then in terms of risk assessment and prevention, like I said earlier, if we can identify individuals according to genetics, we can potentially identify people that are at higher risk of developing the disorder. And then we can potentially develop preventative strategies, things like early interventions or targeted therapies for individuals who are genetically predisposed for these disorders, and then potentially prevent or even reduce the severity of BFRBs. Studying genetics really can provide underlying insights into the underlying biological mechanisms involved in these disorders. So it can shed light on neurobiological pathways, brain regions, neurotransmitter systems that are all contributing to the development and the maintenance of BFRBs. And I did a webinar 2 months ago about the neurobiological elements in BFRBs, if you want to look that up in our YouTube page. And really this knowledge can help researchers and clinicians develop more comprehensive models of BFRBs and identify, again, potentially new therapeutic targets. And finally, a really important thing is that understanding genetics, the genetic basis of BFRBs, could potentially help reduce stigma surrounding these disorders. So recognizing that there's a biological component to these behaviors can help challenge misconceptions that BFRBs are maybe a result of personal weakness or a lack of self-control. So it can raise awareness among healthcare providers, among educators, and really among the general public about the biological underpinnings of BFRBs and the importance of providing support and finding appropriate treatment. Okay, so first I want to start talking about familial studies. So familial studies, they examine the prevalence and inheritance patterns of a trait or of a disorder among family members, such as parents, siblings, and of children. Okay, so overall, start again with overall, grain of salt. Overall, familial studies indicate higher rates of hair pulling disorder and skin picking disorder among relatives of the affected individuals. So in a study of 60 patients with skin picking disorder, 28.3% of their first-degree family members had the disorder. And then another study of 40 patients with skin picking disorder found that 43% had a first-degree relative with skin picking disorder. So in other words, these high percentages suggest that if someone in a family has skin picking disorder, there's a high likelihood, relatively, that other family members may also have skin picking disorder. Several studies of patients with hair pulling disorder now found between 3 to 8% of first-degree family members had the disorder. So this is interesting because this rate is not that much higher than the estimates of hair pulling disorder in the general population that shows a prevalence of around 1 to 3%. So according to these studies, perhaps there's less of an inheritance factor in hair pulling disorder. However, interestingly, and everything contradicts itself in genetics research, but I'm joking, but another familial study of hair pulling disorder found that the risk of hair pulling disorder and OCD appearing in relatives of affected individuals was higher compared to control relatives, while the risk of skin picking disorder didn't show a significant difference between the two groups. So opposite of what the other studies were showing. So in summary, these studies, they show really conflicting results regarding the inheritance patterns among family members of hair pulling disorder and skin picking disorder patients, and really do show the need for further research. Okay, so now that we talked about familial studies, let's talk about twin studies. So twin studies involve comparing something called concordance rates. So concordance rates are the odds of one person having the trait if the other does, and then comparing these rates between identical twins who share 100% of their genetic material and non-identical twins or fraternal twins who share approximately 50% of their genetic material. I see a lot of questions about the slides overlapping. I apologize. It's I think it might be because of the internet over Zoom, but the presentation is being recorded and we will send the recording through to everyone. And it typically has the slides more clearer in the video. So, and it takes some time sometimes to go through. So I apologize. Okay. So talking back about the twin studies and concordance rates. So identical twins who have 100% of their genetic material in common versus comparing to fraternal twins who have approximately 50% of their genetic material in common, or their DNA. And then researchers, they compare the similarities and differences between these twin pairs of identical versus non-identical twins to determine the extent to which a trait or a disorder is influenced by genetic factors. So if a trait's more similar in identical twins than in fraternal twins, it suggests that there's a genetic influence. But on the other hand, if both types of twins show similar levels of a trait, then environmental factors or other factors are considered to play a more significant role. Okay. So as of today, there's only been one twin concordance study conducted in order to estimate heritability rates of hair pulling disorder. Not a lot. So Novak and colleagues did a study on 34 twin pairs. So there was 24 identical twins and 10 fraternal twins. And what they found was concordance rates were significantly different for people with trichotillomania criteria. So 38.1% among identical twins versus 0% among non-identical twins. And then what they did was they broadened the diagnostic criteria of trichotillomania to include skin picking as well, and then also just bothersome hair manipulation. And they didn't find any significant differences in concordance rates. So in other words, what they found was that the odds of twins having the disorder of trichotillomania remained similar, regardless of whether or not these additional behaviors were taken into account or not. So again, this shows the difficulty and the overlap between these two disorders. And maybe there's a potential genetic overlap between hair pulling and skin picking disorder as well. And then what they found was that heritability estimates ranged from 0.76 to 0.78. And again, I just want to remind that a heritability estimate of 0 means that genetics have no influence, and 1 means that genetics is the only factor. But again, I don't want to stress, I want to stress that heritability does not indicate what proportion of a trait is determined by genes, in the sense that it doesn't mean that 70% likelihood of me getting this disorder. It means that 70% or 76% of this trait is caused by genetic variability in the population because of genetic differences among people. So that's the important takeaway here. So, but they did show that there is a strong genetic component. And then, in terms of twin studies for skin picking disorder, there also, as of today, is only one twin study. However, this study had a much larger sample, and if they have a larger sample, they do have, they can draw more conclusive findings and results. So this study, conducted by Manzani and colleagues, they used over 2,500 twins from this UK adult twin registry. And in terms of the prevalence of skin picking, they found that clinically significant skin picking was reported by 1.2% of the twins included in the study. And they found that a higher concordance rates for skin picking was found in identical twins compared to non-identical twins, which indicates a fairly strong genetic influence on the development of the disorder. And then they did an analysis about genetic versus environmental factors, and they found that additive as well as non-additive genetic factors, which means additive meaning that there's more than 2 or more genes that are involved in the trait, or non-additive genetic factors, meaning single genes that are involved in the trait. So these additive and non-additive genetic factors accounted for around 40% of the variance in the skin picking. And then they looked at environmental factors of the twins. So they found that non-shared environmental factors also played a role accounting for the variance, whereas and shared environmental factors were negligible, that they weren't significant. So non-shared environmental factors are any environmental component that makes the twins different from one another, and this also includes measurement error. Whereas shared environmental factors refer to things that are experienced similarly by both twins, raised in the same household or environment, and contribute to the similarities. So they found that the non-shared environmental factors showed the remaining variance of skin picking disorder. So in conclusion, what this study shows, the results show that they suggest that skin picking does have a significant genetic component, and they show that there's both additive and non-additive genetic factors contributing to its development. And non-shared environmental factors also play a very large role, but shared environmental factors of the twins had a minimal impact. So that was interesting findings of the study. So now let's talk about animal models. So researchers can't do genetic manipulation on humans. That's unethical. So what often they will do is they will find similar behaviors in animals and do genetic manipulation on the animals to see if there are any predisposing genes, or if there's any genetic manipulations that are related. So research uses barbering, which is abnormal whisker and fur plucking in mice. And it's a behavior that's just commonly seen in mice. And so they use this barbering as a representative animal model of OCD and related disorders, so particularly hair pulling and skin picking disorder. So Greer and Capecchi did a study and found that mice with a mutation of a specific gene called HOXB8, which is expressed in a variety of brain regions, these mice exhibited excessive barbering to the point of hair removal and skin lesions. So what does this sound like? It sounds like hair pulling and skin picking disorders. Welch and colleagues also, they then demonstrated that mice with a deletion in a gene, specifically called SAPAP3, exhibited compulsive barbering and anxiety-like behaviors. And this is interesting because the gene SAPAP3 codes for a protein that's highly expressed in the striatum in our brain. And if you saw or listened to the webinar that I did about the neurobiological correlates of skin picking and hair pulling disorder, the striatum, it coordinates multiple aspects of cognition. It also coordinates motor and action planning, decision-making, motivation, reinforcement, reward. These are all things that are implicated in hair pulling and skin picking disorder. So it's really interesting that they found that these mice had a deletion in the SAPAP3 gene, and then these mice then exhibited this compulsive barbering and anxiety-like behaviors. And also interestingly, the behavioral abnormalities in these mice were then able to be reversed when administering an SSRI, or a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So this connects to serotonin, which we're going to talk about in a few moments. Just keep this in mind about the mice and the barbering, and that the serotonin reversed their anxiety-like behavior and their barbering behaviors. Okay, so that's all nice that they found this SAPAP3 mutation in mice. What about in humans? So Zuckner and colleagues found multiple rare variants of SAPAP3. Oops, sorry. They found multiple rare variants of this gene, SAPAP3, in patients with OCD and hair pulling disorder specifically. And then another study conducted by Bienvenu and colleagues, they did a family-based association analysis of SAPAP3 and in patients with OCD, and they call them grooming conditions, but this includes skin picking and hair pulling disorder. And Bienvenu and colleagues found that out of 6 specific genetic variations of this SAPAP3 gene, 4 of the genetic variations, and then also all the combinations of these variations, were connected to various grooming conditions, which includes hair pulling and skin picking disorder. Interestingly, they didn't find any association between these genetic variations of the SAPAP3 gene and OCD. And so this is really cool because it shows that this gene and its variations may be specifically associated with skin picking and hair pulling disorder, and potentially could be used to differentiate OCD from these disorders. And that's really important because the guidebook that we use in order to diagnose skin picking and hair pulling disorders, it puts them under obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So it's considered under a family of disorders. And if we can find some way of differentiating, then especially genetically, that could be very, very helpful and significant clinically. Okay, so like I said, things in genetic research often contradict each other. Important to take things with a grain of salt. So there is a flip side to all of this. So more recently, Boardman and colleagues did a study, and they corrected for all of these statistical analyses, multiple comparisons, and they didn't find any association between SAPAP3 genetic variations and either hair pulling disorder or OCD. They did find that one genetic variation of the gene revealed a trend towards significance, but it didn't significantly associated with hair pulling disorder, but it didn't pass the significant cutoff threshold. And then they did a follow-up analysis of genetic variations of these specific mutations. And they found that a block of these mutations did demonstrate a significant association with earlier age of onset of OCD, but not of hair pulling disorder. So really conflicting results. So like I said, again, here we have conflicting results between these studies. So it's important, like I said, to take this all with a grain of salt. But again, here the authors describe the limitation of a small sample of hair pulling disorder patients. They only had 45 people. And they said that maybe this precludes them from being able to draw firm conclusions. Okay, let's talk now about serotonin. Remember, we talked about that with the barbering and the mice. So serotonin, what is serotonin? First of all, serotonin is a neurotransmitter. So it's a chemical, it's a molecule in our brain. And its biological function is really complicated, multi-dimensional, multifaceted. It has a role in modulating mood, in cognition, in reward, in learning, in memory, also in physiological processes. So very wide range. And hair pulling disorder and skin picking disorder have been found to respond positively to selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. However, there are conflicting results from these studies, and currently there's no FDA-approved drug specifically for hair pulling disorder or skin picking disorder. This is important to say. That being said, Hemmings and colleagues conducted a study to examine genetic correlates of hair pulling disorder and serotonin and dopamine. They also investigate that. And what they did was they measured 4 candidate genes representing serotonin pathways and dopamine pathways. And of these candidate genes, they only found that one serotonergic pathway gene variant showed a difference between hair pulling disorder patients and control subjects. And interestingly, the gene that was found to be significantly different is known to play a role in mediating deficits in impulse control. And this is really interesting because impulse control is thought to be implicated both in hair pulling disorder and skin picking disorder. And again, in terms of limitations, the authors said that due to the small sample of participants with hair pulling disorder in the study, there were only 39. They had 150 controls, but only 39 with hair pulling disorder. They said that maybe the serotonin pathway gene might be a false positive. We don't know. But they also said maybe there were false negatives of the other genes, maybe because of low statistical power. So there could be potentially dopamine elements in there. Maybe the serotonin gene is a false positive. Again, we're not sure, but they did find some interesting results. So now I want to talk about one final gene that has been implicated in research recently, and it's called the SLITRK1 gene. Name is irrelevant. So this gene is important for neurite outgrowth. So neurite outgrowth is the process where the developing neurons, or in our brain, they produce new projections as they grow and make new connections. And it's also important for extracellular signaling, so signaling between cells. So this gene has actually been widely investigated for its association with Tourette syndrome. And so Zuckner and colleagues, what they did was they studied genetic variations of this gene in families of European descent with people diagnosed with hair pulling disorder. And what they found was a certain variation of the gene was detected specific to hair pulling disorder cases compared to non-hair pulling disorder controls. And they said that of the 44 hair pulling disorder nuclear families examined, 2 of the 44 had this gene variant, and this accounted for 4.5%. So not that high, but it also is important. And something interesting that they mentioned in the study was that this gene deficiency has also been, or this protein, the gene that codes for the protein of it, protein deficiency, has been shown to cause anxiety-like behavior in mice. So if you mutate the gene, it has been shown to have anxiety-like behavior in mice. And then again, the authors discuss the limitations of a small sample in order to make strong conclusions. But it's interesting to see that this gene has been seen in people with hair pulling disorder, gene mutations, as well as in anxiety behavior in mice. So today we talked about a lot of different studies. And in summary, the genetics of skin picking and hair pulling disorder are very, very complicated, and currently they're not well understood. But I wanted to just present some of the research that is out there now. So in terms of familial studies, overall, they do indicate higher rates of hair pulling and skin picking disorder among relatives of affected individuals. However, there really are conflicting results regarding the inheritance patterns among the family members of people with these disorders. The few twin studies that have been conducted did show higher concordance rates, or the odds of having the disorder if the other twin had it, in identical twins compared to non-identical twins for both hair pulling and skin picking disorder. And this does indicate that there is a genetic influence. And then we talked about some specific genes like HOXB8 and SAPAP3 that have been identified as potential predictors of both skin picking and hair pulling disorders. And more research that we saw has been conducted actually on hair pulling disorder. So we talked about the serotonin pathway genes and this SLITRK1 gene variations that have been shown to be associated with hair pulling disorder. So I kind of want to talk about 2 takeaway messages. So really, there are inconclusive results regarding genetics of genetic underpinnings of these disorders. But on doing more research and having an understanding of the genetic mechanisms eventually should lead to better management and treatment of these disorders. And again, the prospect of genetic testing for these disorders would have substantial consequences for the clinic, for research, and really for public perception of these disorders, which is important. But I do want to underline that these are all really inconclusive results out there right now currently regarding the genetic factors of skin picking and hair pulling disorder. And there really are other elements like behavioral factors, psychological factors that can be unlearned, modified, practiced through therapy that can really help people make meaningful and long-lasting change. Yes, so I'm gonna take some questions now, and I'm gonna stop the recording.